something is important enough, has enough data, and it's important enough that we ought to act on it. So why are we doing that? And in my opinion, that is the single most neglected. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, that is the single most neglected. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, that is the single most neglected. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, that is the single most neglected. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, now is a single most ought to respect. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, now is a single most ought to respect. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, now is a single most ought to respect. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, now is a single most ought to respect. So why are we doing that? In my opinion, now is kind of what truth is and how we know what it is. We talked about the difference between opinion and something that's a warranted belief. An opinion was just something that you happen to think. A warranted belief is here's something that's true and this is why it's true, in such a way that it should convince a reasonable person, as our legal standard would put it, but that it's logically evidenced or that it's materially evidenced in some way. We talked about scientific truths in some cases versus unscientific truths. That is to say, truths that are not provable by experiment. And we noted that things like history is not provable by the method of science. We can use scientific methods to help us build tools that help us inform our understanding of history, and we should do that, and we do that. But you can't repeat the experiment of history and thus determine what happened 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or 2 minutes ago. And then we talked about inductive and deductive reasoning a little bit as well. Now, let's remembering that we want to keep everything on a level playing field, I wanted to point out one last thing on the truth side, and then we'll start talking about these things. And forgive us for graphing things more frequently than not in this class. This is the way that there's so many engineers normally in solid ground. It's our most useful communications method most of the time. Okay, so imagine the y-axis here is how important something is to your life. And then imagine the x-axis is how much evidence, or I'm going to put warrant. Evidence or warrant. And warrant, again, I apologize for using it. It's a philosophical term, but when we say evidence in modern terms almost always means to us one of two things: scientific empirical evidence or something like forensic evidence that is a legal thing. So those are two kinds of evidence, but those are not the only two kinds of reasons for believing things. There's other things that are warranted, like mathematical truths. You don't come forth and put down forensic evidence that 2 + 2 = 4. You make a logical argument that 2 + 2 = 4. So there might be logical evidence that's just simply mental constructs that you use to do that kind of thing. But I think, and you can tell me if you disagree, so this is the first question for your disagreement, that most people think that this is the relationship that we should have. That the more important a belief is to your life, the more evidence or warrant you should have for it. Right? So like, I don't know whether vitamin D is, going to make me live 0.002 seconds longer or not, but I don't really care because it's not a big enough deal. So, you want to tell me it's your opinion? Yeah, maybe I'll take a vitamin D pill. Alternately, no, this is the most important decision I'm going to make in my life. There better be a lot of evidence for it. I think that that's the way that we do it. And we better have understood what the right standards are for it, right? How do you measure something? So let me ask you, you'll forgive me, 5 minutes of philosophy, and then we'll jump right into the material. Somebody comes to you and says, let's judge what the best car is in the world. What do? They say, I know what the best car is in the world. What do you think is the best car in the world? Set the criteria. Why? Right. What does it mean to be the best car in the world? Right? Is it the one that gets you rid of the grocery store the best? That lets you haul around 6 kids? Is it the one that goes the fastest? Is it the one that corners the best? Which one is it? So you have to set a standard to start with, because anybody who owns a Ferrari knows, manual stick shift Ferrari knows that it's maddening to drive it in Northern Virginia, and I don't, but it's maddening to drive it in Northern Virginia because you're just hopping light to light, and when you stop by Wegmans or Giant for food, you can put 2 boxes in your car and then you're done. So it's first you have to figure out what is the standard I'm actually looking for, and then what do you have to do after you have your standard of what you're looking for, your goals of what you're looking for.
You got to figure out how you're going to assess that.
How are you going to measure it, right? So in short, these two things are the right 2 things, which are you have to have a standard and you have to measure it. Give me the top, anybody, give me the top 3 most important decisions you'll make in your life. Marriage. Okay, I'm going to stop there because that was the one I was looking for. All right. Marriage is the most important thing you're going to do. And the things that we're going to do when they're important, the evidence and warrant we're going to look for are, what is the standard we're using? And how are we going to measure it? Now, what's the standard we use to judge our future spouse? No, don't answer how you answer it. How does the average American do it?
Looks.
Does this person look attractive to me? Do we have similar ideas? Do we like the same movies? Do we like the same music? Sometimes it might be like, do we want to have kids? Sometimes that gets figured out after you get married, right? Oh, it turns out she didn't really want kids and he really did, or he didn't really want kids and she really did. Like, what's the standard that we pick? What's a good standard? Virtue, yeah, the virtue. Okay, he's going to list them out by the virtues. Says a lot for his wife right here, but was that what you went back to, you started dating her and you're like, okay. And he pulls back the curtain on his board that he's written of the top 12 virtues, and he gives her a rating of 1 to 10 on each one of those. And if the quotient is above 73, then she's keeper material. Like, do we do that? Should we do that? So it seems like we ought to do something like that. But do we? Is that how people marry people? So even though we think that this is how we ought to do it, let me suggest to you that this is not how we normally do it. We marry people for very frivolous reasons sometimes. We marry people for stupid reasons sometimes. And some of the oldest of us in the class, not myself included, because my wife, I stumbled into perfection and says I'm an outlier on this one. She, if we asked her the question, and had given her truth serum, might answer more along the lines of, I didn't make a good decision, but I made a rapid enough decision. We don't always do it the right way. And what I would point out to you is people do the same thing in terms of religious beliefs and philosophical beliefs and health beliefs and job selection beliefs. Did you lay out all the different potential jobs you could have and decide which one to work at? Or did you take what you stumbled into it and appeared in front of your path? Oh, I got these 2 choices. Only 2 choices of jobs available to you if you don't do any other work. Okay, so I bring this up to say, this is the standard we're going to have in our head, but I'm also going to say that we don't do that. I am going to say that we ought to do that. But in the comparison thing here, we can ask no more and no less of our long-time belief systems than we can of any other long-time important belief system or goal that we have. It was probably not well said, but another way of saying it is this. The topic we're talking about is very important today. But we can't demand of the topic that we're talking about today more proof than we do of the other things in our lives that we also believe, that we invest our lives' effort into. Another way of saying that is, for the Christian, the reason the resurrection is important is they're saying, well, this is something that is a necessary belief of Christianity. If you don't believe in the resurrection, you don't believe in Christianity. And I've dedicated my life to Christianity. And so many of you are probably in here saying something in the back of your minds like, can you show me good proof that what I believe is true? And alternately, if you're not, it might be like, this is one of the reasons I don't believe your stuff, is this idea of a man dying and rising from the dead is frankly ridiculous. It doesn't happen. And so if you believe that, it's a room full of deluded people, which might be the case too. So how are we going to judge it? You have to have standards. You have to have a way to measure it. And although I'm not at this point going to lay out what those standards are, what I'd ask you to consider is, are you using the same standards for everything? And if you're not, it's not fair. And it's hypocritical. So you've got to do it on pain of hypocrisy. Okay. Now, philosophical chiding aside, anybody just raise your hand if you got the book, saw the book, have a copy of the book, Kindle, or whatever else. Okay, good. I'm going to act like we've read part of it. Y'all tell me what is the minimal facts approach? What are the facts that are what are these minimal facts? Okay, Jesus was crucified. And a quick note on what he says minimal facts. What does he mean by minimal facts? Why are these facts the ones that Habermas picked?
Sometimes we get sidetracked by things like, is the Bible true? But it doesn't matter. Those things can be dealt with later. These are the things that are most important as far as someone's salvation. Okay, so these are important for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, but why these facts?
These are the facts that have the greatest consensus among scholars as being...
Yeah, and that's Habermas's opinion. He's saying, as an academician, he says that he although I haven't actually seen what his methodology was in surveying the academic literature, but to the point, even by looking at the spectrum of people from very conservative scholars all the way up to scholars who would say things like, I don't think the Bible's inspired and it's got lots of mistakes in it, and there's lots of portions of it we know are probably not true. All of those people, almost all of those people on this whole spectrum, agree with at least these 5 facts. Now, what they don't agree on what its implications are, but they at least agree that these facts are true facts. Okay, so one was that Jesus was crucified. What's the second fact?
I would say that they don't necessarily agree that they're true, but that they're more likely than not.
More likely true than not. Yeah, so this is, if it brings up a quick point, and we'll go back to the meat here in a second. The word proof means different things to different people. You prove something in court. How do you prove something in court? What are the 2 standards that are most often used?
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, and civil cases, preponderance of the evidence. So in one case, and by the way, preponderance of the evidence may have just been this lawyer did a better job of gathering data than that lawyer did. And so when you put them on the scales, this one weighs down. Beyond a reasonable doubt basically is like, it's still a probabilistic argument, but it's very unlikely. It's unreasonable almost to assume that this other thing occurred. Okay, so those are standards of evidence and judgment that we might use. In proof in mathematics will be something different. The mathematicians will prove that the square root of 2 is a decimal that doesn't end. It's irrational. And the logical proof for that is one of those things that after you run through it and bang your head against the wall 5 times to understand it, you say like, yeah, there's no possible way that can be false. That's very different than there's a preponderance of evidence suggested it's true. So when we're using the word proof here, this is historical evidence. There's no mathematical proof of historical evidence. So back to our scales of justice here. This is where there's an important distinction made. So are you more certain that George Washington was the President of the United States, or the first President of the United States, or are you more certain that 2 + 2 = 4? What do you think? Show of hands for George Washington as the President. Show of hands, 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, but why? I mean, we're pretty sure about both of those, right? Like, nobody that I know is like, it was a conspiracy. There was no first president of the United States. It wasn't George Washington. It was Timmy, Uncle Timmy. Why are we so certain 2 + 2 = 4?
Is true by definition?
In short, it's way easier to prove, and you don't need any external evidence to do it. And by external evidence, I mean you have to like gather facts and figure out their authenticity and their chain of evidence and all that kind of stuff. It's a simpler problem, and therefore one of which we can be more certain.
What I've been taught is that mathematics is the only field of study in which proofs exist. I'm taught that in science there is no such thing whatsoever as proof, and there's no such thing as beyond a reasonable doubt.
I will resist the temptation to go down this rabbit hole, which is my favorite rabbit hole to go down. But in short, there's some truth to what he's saying here, but I would note this. Logic, the
Logic
proper
is a branch
stack.
of mathematics.
Mathematics is a branch of logic.
Okay, how good.
Okay. Logic will undergird math. Math will undergird modern physics. Modern physics undergirds modern chemistry. Modern chemistry undergirds biology, so on. So our stack of and what I mean by this is the way that we understand chemicals to interact. Like you can put hydrogen and oxygen together in a certain way and get, and put enough energy into them, and then you'll get water out of them. So we can say experimentally we can do H2O, but our understanding of how that happens comes from chemistry. Our understanding of chemistry comes from physics. It's these valence electrons that are locking together to do these following things at these angles. And our understanding of physics comes from our understanding of math, because we use mathematics to express these physical truths. And math is based entirely in logic. You can't do things mathematically without doing logical operations. Computer science is on the side here, does this kind of stuff too. Okay, and I bring this stuff up to basically say, if we're going to judge historical truths, what you can't do is say, well, 2 + 2 = 4. I can be sure of that one, but I can't be as sure of these historical truths. Therefore, I'm just going to discard this historical truth. I can't prove that Jesus was crucified anywhere nearly as close as I can prove that 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, this is an unreliable belief. You can do that if you want to, but what happens if you live a life practically like doing that? Only truths that you ever end up banking on are mathematical truths. And so you sit in your house and you starve because you can't say is true that I can drive to the store and not get killed. Or that money, when I hand it to the guy, will actually allow me to buy bread or milk or whatever else. Okay. So what are we going to measure historical claims like Jesus was crucified against? What is fair? Other historical claims we believe. Okay? So if you believe that President Washington was the first president of the United States, if you believe Marcus Aurelius was in the Roman Empire, if you believe that Horatio defended the bridge, if you believe that the Treaty of Westphalia was a good idea, bad idea, whatever else occurred, if you believe those things, these are the kinds of standards and the kinds of measurements that you would use. Whatever you use to measure those are the ones you would use to measure these.
None of those events require any kind of supernatural explanation. So I would say that they're completely different in nature than the resurrection.
What is
if you
this?
want to compare apples to apples, you compare, did Ganesh have his head cut off by Vishnu?
Yes. So this is an important point. We might as well talk about it now. And by the way, you don't have to raise your hand in here, but is anybody else in the room coming from an atheist or agnostic or skeptic position? Other than you. So because you have bravely identified yourself as that guy, we are going to give him extra time, because right now it's like 40 to 1. And so if he wants time, I'm going to give it to him. Is that fair to everybody?
Yes.
And of course, feel free to join his side if you want to and make the arguments. Okay. Well, restate your point, because I've, of course, normally lost it.
I would say that the comparison should be against other supernatural events, not other historical events that don't involve supernatural elements.
So at this point, so I won't derail the meat discussion part, we'll come back to this one, but we won't forget it, because it is maybe the critical question in terms of measurement theory of how we would go about doing this. What's the difference between these two?
I would say supernatural events are events that you're trying to explain outside of normal natural laws, or what happens normally in your...
What do you mean by normal? So like an abnormal event is somebody wins the lottery. An abnormal event
it doesn't circumvent laws of nature, or
what,
it's something that happens every day. Right?
Okay, but what do you mean by laws of nature?
Regularities of nature that we've identified. There may be others that we haven't identified, but we're talking about natural events not controlled by some kind of external cognizant entity that is intervening in what would normally occur.
So the Christian philosopher and theologian, who on the Orthodox, big small O Orthodox side, will say things like the universe all physical existence is maintained and substantiated and supported by God's very thought. And some theologians will say stuff like, if God stopped thinking about us, we would all cease to be. So to the Christian, he might argue with this definition and say, all of the laws that you're talking about simply are the act of God, even sustaining them in existence. And if that's the case, there's no difference between these two.
Well, even if that is the case, that God is responsible for keeping everything going, he or she has set up a set of rules by which the universe normally works.
Okay.
And that we can comprehend and go by. And for example, we know that human beings or any kind of biological entity, when they're dead, they don't come back to life. That's natural.
Yes.
If something were to come back to life, we would have to explain it by a supernatural event like God.
Yes.
Which is what you're trying to do.
Yes.
So, to me, that's clearly a situation in which there's a supernatural explanation trying to explain a supposed event that doesn't occur naturally.
Yes.
And that's why you need a supernatural event to explain it. If it were natural for people to just revive, then it wouldn't have any. We wouldn't use it as.
It wouldn't be a question, right?
It would just be a natural thing. People come back to life.
And by the way, the distinction he's making of like natural and supernatural, which what I'm going to say, the Christian, the properly consistent in their terminology, Christian theologian and philosopher is going to say normal and exceptional rather than natural and supernatural. Because what he's saying is it's normal for God just to support things, and he says, unless I act different, it's like when we drive down the road, you're driving, and if you're driving in a straight line, oftentimes you're putting no input in. Your hands are just resting there. You're not moving your hands to do a steering input, so you're not steering that. Now, technically, your hands are on the wheel, but you're not doing that much steering. When a curve comes up, you put an input in there. So the Christian theologian says God has got his hands on the wheel, but then if he wants to steer, occasionally he will steer. So what that might be is something along, that's the, maybe in the popular term, that's the Jesus take the wheel thing. Like, okay, I'll let most of you guys drive, but occasionally, maybe a better one is you're training your son or daughter as a new driver, and so you're driving along, and they're about to do something, and you reach over, and you input your own steering thing. That's not supernatural. To the Christian theologian, that's God reaching over and taking the wheel away from somebody or something like that. So just know that for the Christian philosopher, they don't see this rigid distinction, but the point he's making is still there, which is it's exceptional for something like this to happen. That unless God otherwise, if God exists, right, that's the undergirding question, unless he otherwise shows up and does something about it, everybody who dies stays dead, right? That's the point that he's making. But in terms of probability, which of these events is more probable than another? Is it more probable that Jesus is raised from the dead or is not raised from the dead?
Say that the natural events are always, by definition, more probable. They're things that we recognize every day. Supernatural event or miracle is almost definitionally the most unlikely thing to occur. That's why you need God to explain it.
Well, maybe it depends on whether you believe in God, I would say. So the most unlikely thing to occur is, let's say something like quantum dynamics is the way the universe is, one of those natural laws, either that emerged from the universe itself or God created in Schrodinger's equation really is the way function that matters. And it's possible, there is a possible universe where all of the molecules in that person's body, all the quantum level events occur to re-innervate that if the person died because their spinal cord got detached and they stopped breathing, that there was a quantum series of events that actually moved all those molecules eventually in the macro level back to repairing the body, and the person comes back to life. So like that's possible in a natural state, but it's highly improbable. It's so improbable, I think I can agree with you that we've never seen that done. And if you ran the kind of like the calculations on that, like the universe would end 10 billion times before such a thing would happen, that kind of thing. So I'm quibbling a little bit, but I want to set up that in short, the probability that one thing happens or another has a lot to do with whether you believe God exists in the first place.
if you bring in supernatural explanations, then you've eliminated the whole idea of probability. Because God can do anything, and if we're just saying, well, God did it, then probability has to do with whether natural events will occur. And we understand that through past experience. And
somebody raise your hand at 9:40. I'm going to run down the probability chain here. At the 9:40, we're going to go back to the minimal facts, because I want to make sure we get all those out today and start discussing a little bit. But I actually think this is incredibly important, and I'm very grateful that you brought this up. Tell me what probability is. When we are making probability judgments, what does that mean? And by the way, if you think that this is just some mathematical construct, think again. This is the most important question that's been raised today, is what does probability actually mean? Because this is how we make decisions. We make decisions based on probability. And if that doesn't sound true to you, realize that your probability judgments are extraordinarily well tuned. Because if I said to you, I want to put you into a machine, and you're going to operate one machine, another person is going to operate another machine. I want you to operate that machine at a closing speed of 120 miles an hour. And I want you to pass by this other person at a range of 3 feet. Okay, so you're going to operate your machine in such a way that it maneuvers, this person operates their machine. I want you to pass by each other at a closing speed of 120 miles an hour, 3 feet within each other. And by the way, the other person's high. Would you do it? Would you do it? Would you sign up for that? Because you do it every day. When you drive in a car at 60 miles an hour on a 2-lane road, and there's somebody out there who's driven that you drove by this weekend that was high, you do that all the time. And you probably don't even have your hands on 10 and 2, you have it on 7 and fries. Right? So we make probability judgments all the time. But we've actually tuned how probable it is that I can operate those vehicles like that. Do you remember the first time you drove and you got on an interstate? Your brain was working properly. What was your brain telling you? I am so close to death. We are about to die. And your brain was right. If you didn't realize that everybody else's brains have figured out to interact in such a way that it doesn't kill you usually. Okay, so what is probability? Back to you. What is probability? Okay. While he's looking it up, yes, sir, go ahead.
Isn't the point fair that, like, if we heard something that happened last month where this person gave a prophecy, and it's like that's one explanation is that God told him, and the other one's like his brother works in radio and like hidden microphones.
Yeah.
It's like if they're both like equally probable, or even if like we give the weight towards the non-supernatural.
Yeah, should we prefer the non-supernatural explanation? And I'd say, generally speaking, the answer would be yes. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, the book talks about the most plausible explanations. I would say probability is the most plausible thing that would happen.
So I agree there. So what's the difference between plausible and probable? Plausible, and oftentimes we mean plausible to mean something like more than 50% probable. So we would say something like this: between those two explanations, which one's the one that's more plausibly true? Which is another way of saying which is the one that's more probably true if we're making a probability judgment. So plausibility is not strictly related to probability that way, but we often use it as meaning more probable.
And most people are not as, maybe don't approach this as, empirical evidence-based. I would say most people that I talk to, bring in some knowledge that they have, but maybe don't approach it from a scientifically, based approach.
Yes, that's probably right. Yes, sir. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say, so the question we're going to have is how or what happened, and then we have to ask the question how it happened, but what happened.
Okay, but hold on. We're going to do one thing at a time here until 9:40, and then we'll do that. So what's probability?
It's a big rabbit hole trying to look at that, but
yeah.
Let's go with the likelihood that an event will occur.
Yes.
Generally, it's determined by a standard curve or a bell curve, and there's a normal distribution in the middle, and this is most things that happen, and then there are standard deviations where things become less and less likely to occur.
Yes, and that's for things that conform to normal curves. You may have bimodal curves, you may have shifted curves, and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, let's call this a good definition of probability. But what is the essence of probability? So I'll give you an example. On what does it, why do we make probability judgments versus judgments of which we know are certain? And what I mean by that is this. Heaven forbid this would be the case, but you are in Vegas and you're sitting at a blackjack or a poker table or blackjack table or something like that. And you look down at the cards and you realize that if the guy across from you has the king of spades, then he wins. And if he doesn't have the king of spades, then you win based on the cards that you can see here. What is that? What are we actually saying? Are we saying that there's a probability, that there's a 27% chance that when he flips that card over, it turns into the king of spades? What are we actually saying? How likely is it based on what we know and the remaining cards that we can't see and how many of those cards are in the deck? What's the probability that that already is the king of spades? Now, quantum mechanics acts differently. Sometimes some explanations act like they're saying when you turn it over, it turns into the king of spades. But I think that there's not good reason to believe that. At least for us at the macro level, a medium-sized scale level, when we're talking about, I don't know what the card is. So based on just what's left, I'm going to say that it's probably this one. Now, if it's the case that you're cheating and you saw him, the dealer put that king of spades down with a camera you had underneath it, what's the probability that it's the king of spades? What would we say the probability is? 100%, right? We would say we're certain of it. Now maybe, there's that last little fraction of like, well, maybe it was, you missed it or whatever else. But that's the probability judgments are only made when we don't know the answer. It's when we're guessing based on the possibilities that remain. Yes, sir.
I just also add that probability judgments are always referencing some sort of basis.
Yes, right. And this is why we'll get into it later. When this is not a threat, and this is we're going to talk a little bit about Bayesian probability. So be prepared for that. It's not hard. It's just it's something that's very helpful to think about. So I want to we'll go back to the main gear here that we're talking about. But I want you to maintain this point, and every time that we're talking about stuff in here, please think about what probability is, what it isn't, and the fact that we make judgments of things of which we are not 100% certain. That is to say that we know, what if I said, what's the probability is a black coffee cup here, and you satisfied yourself as a coffee cup, that we're not making a probabilistic assessment at this point. We're making some other kind of assessment.
I'll make one last point
Please.
based on this example because I think it demonstrates what I was trying to say.
Yes.
If we are determining the probability of somebody having a particular card and we're ruling out cheating and that kind of thing,
Yes.
it's going to depend on naturalistic assumptions,
Yes.
right? That the cards don't change once they're in his hand.
Yeah.
But if God is there, if we assume God might be involved in this card game,
Yes.
then he can change that card. It doesn't matter what's in his hand.
That's right.
Right? And when he turns it over, it could be an ace of spades, and then it turns over and it's a king of clubs.
Right.
That's why I say probability goes out the window when you start bringing in supernatural explanations.
Well, what you
so
have.
you can't apply probabilistic reasoning to supernatural events.
Well, this is why what you have to do is apply Bayesian probabilistic reasoning, which is, by the way, not some weird version of probability that comes out. This is the way science, all of science is heading now, is Bayesian probability.
Bayesian probability depends on prior probabilities.
Yes.
And that doesn't matter if God is going to intervene.
Well, what you're talking about is what are the priors. We should at least be able to set what are the priors that God intervened. And to your point, of all the events that go on in the world, and how many of them do God intervene in this special way? And I think we're happy to agree with each other that that's very, very, very infrequent. So you can't turn around and say it's equally probable that this guy was dealt the king of spades, but that he turned it over and God changed it into the queen of hearts. Or that it's equally probable that the guy cheated. He swapped the cards, right? Which one of those is a more probable event in the number of times that it occurs? Somebody's cheating, right? So all things being equal, ceteris paribus, preferring a natural explanation is at least the way that we reason frequently. And maybe, I would say further, is the way that we ought to reason based on the number of times that it happens based on the priors. Even claimed priors, right? So I think we agree, but I disagree with you when you say you can't judge at all supernatural events. And here's why. And then thank you for the reminder. I'll just do this one really quickly. Total number of events, events that are natural, and total number of events that are supernatural in the history of the world. Okay, we can make up numbers, depends on what you call an event, but let's at least say that this is much, much greater than the ones that happen supernaturally. Right? God intervenes, especially, far less frequently in any biblical set of stories than he lets natural law, so to speak, run. So it is certainly the case that absent the definition that the Christian philosopher uses of all events are supernatural events, that this is the relationship. So it is much more highly probable of a naturalistic explanation. Okay. So that's a lot to keep in mind, and I apologize. And if it's unclear to you now, don't worry about it. We'll suss this stuff out later. But let's go back to the facts. Where did I write them down? Okay. The first one was Jesus was crucified. Okay, so don't have to worry too much about the supernatural side on that one. That one's fairly naturally explainable. All right, what was the second fact? Yes, ma'am.
The disciples' lives were changed, and transformed.
They believe in song.
Yeah, so that'll be further down the list, but yes, disciples believed. They saw him rise from the dead.
Hey Scott, why isn't the first one Jesus existed?
Because one entails the other. You could say there were 6 minimal facts. The first one is that Jesus existed, and the second one is that he was crucified. But since so many people already, even the kind of opposition, so to speak, oftentimes agrees that Jesus was crucified, entailed in Jesus was crucified is that Jesus existed. So it's a shortcut. That they saw him raised. Okay. From the dead. Okay, what was number 3?
Did we expand on number 2 or not? That the idea that pretty much not any of them believed that he was raised until sometime later.
I'm just at this point, I'm just asking what the agreed upon facts are. What was the third one or another one?
Conversion of Paul changed.
Yeah, Paul's life changed significantly. He went from persecuting the church, an enemy of the Christians, to one who was martyred on the
How is that different than 2?
Paul wasn't one of the initial 12 disciples or 11 remaining disciples that saw him raised from the dead.
The disciples were literally eyewitnesses day to day. It's possible that Paul was in those circles, but it's not certain. It was definitely in the persecution phase.
Okay, so he was raised from the dead, let's say, and appeared to them. Okay, Paul's life was changed, as in the way that we said. What's the next fact?
Empty tomb.
Okay, the tomb was found empty. What else?
James.
James, brother of Jesus, changed. We'll just say changed in the interest of writing it down. Changed from being skeptical of my brother is the Son of God to, no, I'm a scion of the church and I believe all this stuff. I believe he was raised from the dead, etc. Okay. Anything else we would add to this, or are these the minimal facts? According to the material, okay.
Does Habermas also talk about the earliness of these beliefs?
So he does, and now this goes into not what the beliefs are, but what warrant do we have to believe these things? So on the one side, you could, if you wanted to, it depends on how deep you want to dive into this. So here we are at a particular point right now. Here are 5 facts that we can say something like this. The supermajority of scholars, ranging from conservative to liberal, anybody who studies this, seriously studies this in kind of scholarly terms, they agree with these 5 facts. Now you'll notice that they say things like the disciples believed that they raised from the dead. It's not saying the same thing as the disciples saw the risen Christ. What it means is they believed they saw the risen Christ. There's a difference. But this, and that's why many of the very liberal scholars, or even less liberal scholars, will say, yeah, no, that's fairly clear historically speaking. This is different to saying this is how we prove these facts, or this is why these scholars believe these facts. That's a separate question. So the shortcut version of this is something like this. Look, I don't know anything about historical methods. I don't want to get into this. What is the consensus of historians on this? What's the consensus of science on this one? By the way, we do this all the time. And the consensus of science is bacon's not good for you. So if you want to, get healthy, stop eating bacon or something like that. We say this all the time. Bacon's my favorite project to talk about. The idea, though, of whether we ought to believe that or not, we're not getting into that. We're punting and saying, I'm going to leave it to the experts. The point that Habermas makes is the experts say these facts are historically highly reliable. Or another way of saying it is, these are true historical facts. The next step post that is, what's the best explanation of them? And that's where you get into probability and all that kind of stuff. But what's the explanation of them is different from, are these facts true? So these are the agreed upon facts. Now, we can dive into it, and if that's what we want to do at the time, we will do that. And we've got 3 more weeks of this. And what I'll say is, for those who are interested, depending on your schedules, we are going to continue this discussion past the 4 weeks. What I'm going to make a strong effort towards is, in honor of those who only signed up for 4 weeks, we will cover the material, the principal material here in 4 weeks' time. But in 4 weeks' time, we will not be able to answer all rabbit holes. So in some cases, you may hear me say something like, we're going to call this class phase 1 and phase 2. That's a phase 2 question. I'll give you a 60-second explanation of it, but the back and forth that we really want to have on it, we'll do that in phase 2 for those that want to stick around. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. When I use words like warrant and necessary existence, people are like, could you just stop, please, and talk about the material in the class? I got it. So phase 1 and phase 2 are going to be slightly different.
It seems like there's even more essential of the essential. So the most essential from my perspective was Jesus was crucified. If that's true, that means he had to exist. That the tomb was empty, so that he wasn't there was no explanation for that. And then on top of that, that essentially the disciples believed they saw him rise from the dead. So essentially you're establishing that Jesus rose from the dead, and that he was alive, somehow appearing to people in a way that people cannot explain, to your point, after he was crucified, or he was killed, and he was buried, thus, therefore he was dead, yet he was still appearing to people somehow, and his body has no account.
So I take it, to your point, maybe some of these facts are more important than others. Like, is there a fact, well, I'll ask it this way in response to your question. Habermas calls these the minimal facts. Are there any facts in here that we could drop and it would not change the probability? So Habermas's subsequent step, the one that happens after all right, hey, has everybody agreed these minimal facts are true? And everybody's like, yeah. There's one guy on the fringe who's like, no, I don't think Jesus existed. And they're like, okay, I got it, but look, on the bell curve, they sit out in the 4 standard deviations, 5 standard deviations below the mean of consensus. So they're considered fringe. Fringe, I don't like the term fringe because more often than not, and historically speaking, in the history of science at least, the fringe guys turned out to be right. So just because somebody's fringe doesn't mean that they're wrong. But in terms of consensus, it means they're outside the consensus. But are any of these that you could drop? His next step is the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. Now, we've got to do a little bit of work to get there, but that's his next step is what's the explanation of these facts? What's the historical? Note that fact 2 is that they believed he raised from the dead. That's the agreed upon fact. Not everybody is, the consensus of everybody that I talked about there is not that he actually raised from the dead. It's that the disciples believed he raised from the dead. So how do you get from the disciples believe that he raised from the dead to like, no, that's what actually happened? To your point as well. Yes, sir.
Just a really tiny note. In my mind, 2, 3, and 5 are technically identical.
So that's right. So 3 and 5 would be 2 other disciples. So I'll say, we'll call this the 11. 11 original disciples. And there's
you're just breaking them out, that's all.
Yeah, that's right. But the reason they're...
The thing is, the other 2 were skeptics before.
So were the 11. Not one of the 11 believed when the women came and said, "Oh, he's raised from the dead." Not one of the 11 believed. They all doubted.
Yeah,
but they were still his disciples.
They were in the group.
Yeah, I will agree with you. At the end of the day, we'll say by the time that 40 AD rolls around, all those guys are the disciples.
Yeah, so I mean, it's no different with Paul or with James. It's no different.
Well, I think the difference would be one went from Peter was not actively persecuting the other disciples and throwing them in jail and having them killed. So that would be one difference.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there is evidence outside of the Bible for claims 1, 2, and 4. So my question would be, do we have evidence outside of the Bible for claims 3 and 5?
Yes, and most of it comes from the writings of what are called the early apostolic fathers. So you'll see guys like there's some debate out there, but Clement is supposedly in fairly direct line from disciple A, and Origen from disciple B, and so you've got these guys who claim to be disciples of the disciples who are writing, and so that's where a lot of that material comes from.
I've got 2 quick points, and you don't have to respond to them since I've already taken up so much time.
No, you get the lion's share of the time, so don't feel wrong to claim it.
I would say that point 4 is more controversial today than it was when Habermas wrote this book. There are key scholars like John Dominic Masson and Mark Herman who don't believe that Jesus was buried. They think he was thrown into a common grave, as was typical for most people that were crucified. And I think, but I'm not sure, I think even Habermas has admitted now that this isn't a consensus point. I'd have to go check, but I would say that one is the least, has the wobbliest ground.
Yes.
And I do think it's important to realize that these aren't points that scholars say, yes, this absolutely happened. And even if you say they're 90% likely, it's 10% likelihood of falsehood for each one of those points, which is 50% probability of falsehood for any one of the 5.
Well, so if you're going to assign probabilities solely based on a naive estimate, you have ceased to do prior probability assessment.
Well, I mean, we would have to go through each point and,
yes,
and
that's
determine
right.
that.
And that's
so I'm just saying, if we say that these are 90% probable, and I think probably they're not 90% probable, they're probably less probable than that by most scholars. They're just saying, yeah, they get over the 50% line. But if you give them 90% probability, which is higher than they probably deserve, then there's a 50% probability that one of them is wrong.
Right. Well, except that sort of. That's not how probability works. That only works that way if the probabilities are dependent probabilities, where each one of this one has to be true in order for that one to be true.
Now, if each one has a 10% probability and you've got 5 statements, even if they're not connected, there's still a 50% probability that one of them is wrong. So you've got 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. That's 50%.
If you're going to combine probabilities that way, though, that entails a causal relationship, a particular causal relationship. You know what I'm saying? So there's independent, there's dependent probability, and you can't combine probabilities willy-nilly without determining whether these are dependent probabilities or independent probabilities. And by the way, I'll say this is not simple. I watched one of my favorite YouTube educators on math completely mess this up as well, where they were saying, here was this probability, right, this had to do with the presidential election and voting stuff like several years ago, and he confused dependent and independent probabilities, and the guy does math for a living. So like this happens. It's not simple. It's not easy.
I'll concede that point, but still at least 10% probability that any given one of them is incorrect, I would say. But I actually think the probabilities that any one of them is incorrect is higher than that.
Well, if you're now to the point of probability judgment here, how are you establishing the probability? There's a 10% probability that Jesus was crucified.
That's arbitrary. But I'm basing it on what I think scholars would likely say, right? Because we don't know that.
That may be the case, but the point that I would make is you can't combine 5 arbitrary probabilities and get a well-reasoned probability.
But I'm being arbitrary on the conservative side, and also I'm pointing out that Habermas is also not telling us probability. He's only telling us these are what scholars think likely happened.
That's
So that's 51%. So if I wanted to be not generous, I would say there's only a 51% probability on each of these 5 facts.
So I don't know that, I'll tell you why I don't agree with that, and then I'll go back to your point, because I don't think we finished answering yours. The consensus that Jesus was crucified, I don't think that anybody puts that at 50%.
I agree.
In the
I put
scholars.
that one closer to like 95, 98.
Okay. That the disciples believed they saw him raised from the dead. Now, these are arbitrary, by the way. I'm not going to hold you to it.
And I'm not going at what percentage of scholars think that this is likely, but if you were to ask each of those scholars, how sure are you of it?
Yes, that's what I'm asking. How sure are they?
I don't know what they would say.
Yeah, so I'll tell you that one of the reasons that he did this. Let's now leave out the tomb was empty for a second, and just talk about these other ones. Scholars would tell you that that's historically certain. These scholars, the consensus would be, but that's Habermas's point, is that these guys are saying these are the facts that they would say these are fairly incontestably true. That's what Habermas's point is. Now you can disagree with him, and he's not turning around and saying, I know that because I've got some magic television that looks back in history. What he's saying is, if I'm only basing my judgment on the consensus of historians that work in here, those are the facts that the historians say are historically certain. Outside of that, conclusions like, and therefore he raised from the dead, that's not, he's not saying that there's a consensus about that.
I think most responsible scholars would say that none of this is certain because it's all history that happened 2,000 years ago.
That's why I'm saying historically certain. And this is where we're back to this right here. So now the question gets into what you raised earlier, which is this is comparative historical stuff. So here we're going to do something like put Jesus was crucified, and this is going to be Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. Now, which of those is a more certain fact, historically speaking? Which one has more evidence? Now, in terms of historical evidence, this is like times 100 weight of Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. In terms of preponderance of evidence, in terms of recency of a supposed historical event to when things were written about that event. So this is a very, 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 very foot stomp important point. This is where we, not him, all of us, cheat ourselves all the time, is we don't know what the standards are that historians use, and we don't realize that the kinds of stuff, it was in one of the chapters that was talking about, and I'm terrible about memory, these aren't chapters, I'll have to look it up for you, but the part where they're talking about the creeds that Paul was citing, and when Paul's writing was done. This is within a handful of years from this supposed historical event. And I think the author uses the term, this is historical gold. That is to say, historians drool, I think he used the term drool over having ancient attestation that is sub-decade away from the actual event. None of this right here is attested to within anywhere near that timeline. And the number of independent sources that do so are 1 or 2, whereas it's something like 5 or 7 in the case of some of these facts on this side. So even there's something that feels weird about it because we're like, no. One of these is religious stuff, and the other one is historical, political stuff. Now think about that for a second. Someone's like, religious truths, what's the chances that something said by religious people is correct? Like, surely political truths are more certain. Are they? Anybody know any recently contested political truths? Is there any kind of fight going on about that one? Depends on who wins the news wars and writes the textbooks in the next 20 years. But if the Fox Corporation writes what happened from 2016 to 2024, and CNN Publishing Corporation writes what happens and they have the textbook, you think that you're going to get the exact set of balanced facts on either side? Or is one of them going to be more biased in one direction, one in the other? So you have to realize that the winners write the history books in some cases. Yeah. But in terms of historical attestation, the certainty that Jesus was crucified is some historians have called the most certain ancient historical fact that we know. So to your point of like 95% plus, I agree with that. Now the subsequent question is, well, what about the other ones? And I'm just I want to make the case for you that the manner that we judge those is not, is this a political truth? Because those are not things that people aren't willing to write false things about, right? Another way of thinking of it is, it's very rare for a conqueror to build monuments to his failures, right? They tend to talk about their successes, and it's probably a little bit one-sided. Okay, I've had a lot of hands and I missed them. I gave you the floor first, sir, and then back to Steve. Did you have another point? No, good? Okay, all right. Steve.
So it sounds like the question, at least that I'm taking away from the conversations we had earlier, is can we convert historical evidence evaluations into a common mathematical value of reliability? I'm writing that down, but basically, are they compatible, right? Or are we going to have to go to each one of those and try to say, okay, there's a little bit of subjectivity here, almost certain, possible, most likely, some sort of, or is it absolutely we can go down and say there's a 50% chance, there's a 90% chance, and it sounds like if you don't clarify that, you're going to try to apply two things that are essentially incongruent, or they are congruent, I'm not sure.
So I'm interested in doing that, but I'm also interested in doing that compared to, let's do this over here. Okay, and this is Nero burned Rome, or Rome burned under Nero. This one right here is Horatio fought at the bridge. All right, and let's put in 5 more historical facts that occurred roughly in that same time frame. And then what we're going to do is say, all right, we'll call this one fine, Scott, 95% for this one. And we'll say this one is 90%. And we'll say this one is 90%. We got pretty good evidence of that one. We'll call this one 50-50 for argument's sake. Or would you prefer lower probability? Okay. 50-50. And at James, because we just got less data on James typically than we do, we got good data on James, but we'll call this one 75%. All right. Now, so here we got a bunch of judgments we got to make about what happened around this guy was a religious teacher that claimed to be God, crucified, and his disciples were like, he's back. And all this stuff happened, and then the church kind of gets started. Now, what's this one? Nero burned Rome, or that Rome burned under Nero.
Well, how many attestations do we have to that?
And so here's an example of the kind of question you have to ask if you're going to turn around and do what Steve asked us to do. Now, I'll tell you this, historians don't do this. There's no accepted historical rubric, matrix, against which you say, okay, if two sources and source A has reliability factor 7 and source B has reliability, nobody does that.
Shouldn't they though?
Well, I think there's a good argument to saying that they should.
And spending so much time on probabilities of this or that or the other thing, shouldn't it be grounded in something factual?
Well, how do you establish what's factual? That's the whole question.
Okay, so
It's easy to say, well, we just need to deal with the facts. Okay, these facts occurred 2,000 years ago. Which ones are facts and which ones are legend?
but wouldn't an attestation by somebody close to the event be equivalent to a fact?
It would be, except we also have, to his point, these are not the only miracle claims out there, right? We got other claims in similarly ancient writings of guys saying yep, no, I saw this winged dragon pop up and blow smoke, fire at this other guy. I saw another person. This is not the only claim of people rising from the dead. There are claims in multiple ancient sources that talk about this person has risen from the dead, or this person was killed and somehow they survived this obviously what should have been lethal wound, that kind of thing. So those kinds of things happen.
So then why do we talk about the probability if facts can't be known?
Well, the question is, what do you mean by known? And this is my point, is how certain can we be? And this is why I was saying, it feels like, and I think it's true, that we can be more certain that 2 + 2 = 4 than that George Washington was president of the United States in the the late 18th century. Okay? That's true. But my point is, we don't stop believing things for that reason. We believe things of which we can be very provably certain, but we also believe a whole lot of things. And when I say believe, I don't mean think. So the difference to me between think and believe, I think A is true and B is false, or not A is false. I believe A is true. When I use that word, that means I act like it is true and it matters to me. And the Christian has heard this all the time to do with a chair. I can say, I think that chair will support my weight. But you don't know whether the person believes that that chair will support their weight unless they stand on it or sit on it. Then you're like, okay, obviously you believe that what you think about the chair is true. So that's how I'm using those two words. So in that version of it, we already, and my point is, that I'm trying to make, and I will continue to make until you start throwing rotten tomatoes, and then I'll dodge the rotten tomatoes and continue to make the point while attempting to throw the non-rotten tomatoes back, is that we already act like we believe lots of things that have far, far fewer less attestation than other things that we say we don't believe. And that's not fair. It's not honest. We have to be consistent.
I just throw out there as well that I think the reason why the minimal facts argument approach is a good one is because typically a majority of honest academics will agree with most, if not all, of these facts. So you're saying, hey, let's just look at the common ground between us and what is the best explanation for this common ground. Even folks like Richard Dawkins, when you press them on it, they have to agree with it. Now, if you want to sit here and pick apart these things, maybe that's where you move to a stronger argument, where if you really want to dig down into something, you go into one of these inductive or deductive arguments for the existence of God, or Christ, or any other topic. But that's just a different material. The minimal facts approach is just nice because you can establish very common ground on, hey, do we agree that history is generally reliable?
Yeah, and so this is a good point, and I thank Michael for making it. The idea here is, again, these numbers right here are not, we're not making the argument that those numbers are justified in any way other than the experts think that those are the numbers. That's what Habermas is saying. Okay, now, if you're like me, I'm fairly skeptical of experts. Okay, so I may say things like, well, the experts may all agree on that one, but I would like you to show me personally why the experts are right on that one. What was their methodology? Why do they think so? But in doing so, it's, unless I'm going to be a hypocrite, I should not be any more skeptical of these kinds of truths than I am other kinds of truths. Because what happens if I make an assumption, like, and I'm going to pick, not on you, but on many atheists and skeptics that have come into this class, have later said that they came in with an assumption like this. I'm working on the assumption that there is no God because that's a positive proof. And it's simpler to assume, the naive estimate is there is no God. So you're going to say that there's a God, you've got to prove that first, and then you can reason based on that. If you're going to come in, though, and ask the question of, does God exist, and your assumption is that he does not, what are you possibly going to be guilty of if you're not careful? I'm not saying that you are yet, but what are you possibly going to be guilty of? So, assuming that which you already have to prove, okay, which we've all got to be careful about not doing that. And so, if you're going to make an assumption like God does not exist, it assumes that you have done some work, mental work, to decide why it's the case that God does not exist. And saying something, and so if I said something like this, there's a land in Africa, and it has this particular name, and there's a king of that land. Your going in assumption ought not be that guy doesn't exist. What should your going in assumption be if you've never heard of this land? I don't know whether he exists. You're telling me something new. What's your argument? What's your evidence that this guy exists? Then you look at the evidence, you're like, here's the flag of the country, here's the photos, here's a history book about it, that kind of stuff. You're like, oh, okay, seems legitimate. I assume that guy may exist. By the way, that's how we learn everything in history and about everything about Namibia and South Africa, unless you've been there personally, okay? Now, let me, because I'm out of time, let me give you the last word, but let me say three things very quickly. Okay, we have at least listed what the 5 facts are. These are the 5 agreed upon facts by the consensus. Just because it's the consensus doesn't make it true, but this is the consensus of the scholars in there. Ways that we can go from here include the following. 1, we can talk about why that's a consensus view, what the historical standards are, and why even liberal scholars believe that these are true facts. Or we can say, nope, we want to take the expert opinion on this one. And so the next step is, we'll go into Habermas's next step, which is, why does he think that somehow adds up to Jesus actually raised from the dead? Because those are 2 different claims. So that's another thing that we will do over the course of the next couple weeks. And then the third part is, we will keep going back and forth a little bit into this, like, are we judging fairly? So if I can ask for a homework assignment, and if you're willing to do it, this will significantly enhance the learning experience in here if you're willing to do it. This week, pick anywhere between 3 and 5 things that you base your life in. What I mean by that is this, that they're essential to your life. That is to say, if you didn't believe these things, your life would change significantly. For the Christians in the room, forget Christianity. Leave that one out. I got it. We don't know that one. Other than Christianity, what are 3 or 5 things that you believe that if you didn't believe them would significantly change your life? And then list out next to each one of those why you believe those things are true versus false. And then for bonus credit, how did you measure them and against what standard? This is very important. I asked this a lot of burden on you too, but if you don't want to do that, I will try to strawman the argument, but I might be guilty of strawmanning it, so I leave it to you to hold me honest as to whether I do that, unless, of course, you do something similar, in which case that would be great. Okay, we have 1 minute left before we have to be done. You have the last one.
So everything that you're showing on the screen right now is leading to something that is impactful to how I live my life.
Yes.
The items on the right, they're just historical things that don't really have much impact on my life.
Yes.
So to me, if I were to play the skeptic, I would want to base or do comparative analysis of historical minimal facts on things that are important to my life to be fair in terms of the rigor of what I want to actually use as a basis for.
So this is a great question, and of course he asked it in the last 60 seconds. So what we will do is next week, somebody who actually remembers things, because it's not you and me, let's write this down, bonus on you. We start with this one next week, because this is a great question. We need to be able to answer that.
I was just getting ready to write it down.
Good for you, okay.
Roger
that, okay.
In fact, actually, unless you're staying for home front, we all have to.
Yeah, we need to get out, but let me end on saying this one. I know, with your permission, 30 more seconds with your permission.
Hey guys, let's Scott for the last 20 seconds.
Yeah, let me ask your indulgence. I know that this talking about probabilities and assessment methods and metrics and all that, I know it's hard and it's brain befuddling and it's a pain. But if you will indulge me, I will give you this promise. If by the end of the next 2 weeks you don't see the point of why I've done so, I will stand up and give you a 10-minute talk, rigorous talk in plain language as to why it's so important. So if it doesn't become obvious to you by then, I'm begging your indulgence. Please try at it. It's one of those things you have to fight hard through it, but it's one of those things that when you get it, it is like riding a bike. It will click one day and all of a sudden you're riding a bike. And it's wonderful, and it will change the way that you look at things. It's very, very important. So please indulge me, I'm begging you. If you don't see it on your own, at least do it for my begging. Thank you very much. We'll see you all next week.